the time a monastery burned and no one could scream. In the shadowed corridors of medieval monastic life, silence was more than a rule. It was a sacred vow, a discipline that defined the very essence of the monastic calling. This silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a powerful spiritual practice, a means of subduing earthly desires and focusing entirely on divine contemplation. Yet there came a moment in history where this vow of silence became a haunting curse, when a monastery burned and the monks, bound by their sacred oath, could not scream for help. This is the chilling and tragic story of when silence itself became a silent killer. Monasticism in medieval Europe was governed by strict rules codified in texts such as the Rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped monastic life for centuries. Among its precepts was the command for silence, especially outside designated hours for communal prayer and work. The rule emphasized restraint of speech to guard the soul from worldly distractions and sins. In this culture, even the simplest utterance required permission, and the breaking of silence was met with severe punishment. This absolute control of speech was intended to cultivate humility and obedience, essential virtues in the pursuit of spiritual perfection. Imagine a monastery isolated in its cloistered world, walls thick with stone and echoes of whispered prayers, where the weight of silence hung heavy in the air. Within these stone walls lived men who dedicated their entire lives to prayer, study, and work, but never to raising their voices except in measured, sacred liturgy. The vow of silence was integral to their identity, an armor and a chain alike. But what happens when this sacred silence collides with mortal peril? One of the darkest recorded incidents revealing the tragic consequences of this vow occurred during a devastating fire at a monastery in medieval times. Historical accounts, though sparse and often fragmented, tell of a conflagration that engulfed the monastery while the monks remained bound by their oath. The fire spread quickly through wooden beams and thatched roofs, smoke filling the air with choking intensity. Yet the monks inside could neither cry out nor call for aid, their silence enforced even as flames encroached. The silence that had once been a path to divine peace transformed into an unthinkable prison. Monks, trapped and terrified, watched the deadly blaze consume their sanctuary. No alarm sounded, no desperate cries for help broke the air. Their voices were imprisoned by their discipline, their faith demanding restraint even in the face of death. The fire was merciless, and many monks perished in the smoke and flames, their death silent and unseen beyond the monastery walls. To understand the gravity of this tragedy, one must appreciate the context of monastic discipline. Obedience was paramount. Monks surrendered their wills to the abbot's command and the holy rule. To speak without permission was not merely a breach of etiquette, but a spiritual failing that threatened the entire community's sanctity. Thus, even in chaos, the fear of sin or disobedience overpowered the instinct for survival. This event exposes a cruel paradox. The very virtues cultivated to approach holiness became the instruments of doom. The commitment to silence, a spiritual fortress, became a cage with no escape. The monks' last moments were engulfed in smoke and flames, yet not a single scream escaped to pierce the night. The image of silent death is both haunting and profoundly tragic, a testament to the extreme demands of medieval monasticism. The psychological burden on these men was immense. To endure a deadly fire silently requires unimaginable strength and faith, but also reveals the tragic cost of religious discipline taken to its extremes. For the monks, the silence was obedience. For us, it is a sobering reminder of the human cost behind devout asceticism. Historical reflections on this incident ripple through centuries as warnings against unyielding dogma that suppresses natural human responses in moments of crisis. It invites us to question the balance between spiritual devotion and the basic instinct to survive and communicate. How can faith remain alive when it demands the silence of desperation? This story also serves as a window into the stark realities of medieval life, where discipline and ritual often outweighed personal freedom. The fire that consumed the monastery is not just a physical disaster, but a symbolic one. A burning away of life, silenced by devotion. It challenges our modern sensibilities about obedience and the limits of spiritual sacrifice. Monastic silence was designed to elevate the soul above the chaos of the world. Yet in this moment, the world's chaos engulfed the monks, and their souls could not cry out. Their silent deaths call to us across the centuries, a solemn echo reminding us that even in pursuit of the divine, the human voice and the will to live remain vital. As we remember this tragic fire, we must hold in our hearts the complex tension between faith and survival, discipline and freedom. The monk's silence teaches us both the power and the peril of absolute obedience. It reveals a dimension of medieval spiritual life rarely spoken of, a life where silence could mean peace, but also the silencing of the very breath of life itself. This harrowing moment is a testament to the profound depth of medieval monasticism, a discipline that shaped souls and lives, but exacted its ultimate price in fire and silence. The monastery burned, and no one could scream, yet through this silence their story screams to us still, demanding to be heard. This is the story of the time a monastery burned and no one could scream. A story not just of fire and ash, but of silence, faith, and the terrible cost when the two collide. The medieval monks who copied books until their fingers bled. Imagine a world before the hum of printers, before the glow of screens, where knowledge, history, and literature existed only as fragile manuscripts painstakingly recreated by hand. In the dim, flickering candlelight of medieval monasteries, monks labored relentlessly in scriptoriums, copying texts with such devotion that their fingers literally bled, their eyes strained against the shadows, and their bodies bore the marks of physical sacrifice. This was the world of the manuscript copyists, guardians of knowledge whose work shaped the intellectual foundation of the Western world, yet whose suffering is rarely told. The medieval scriptorium was more than just a room. It was a sacred workshop where words were transmuted into vessels of culture and faith. Here, monks spent 12 or more hours each day hunched over desks, their quills scratching ink onto fragile parchment. The work demanded a precision and patience beyond measure. Each letter, each word had to be perfectly formed, not only to preserve the original text, but to honor the divine truth it represented. A single mistake could ruin an entire page, forcing the monk to painstakingly scrape off ink or start anew. The environment was harsh and unforgiving. Manuscript copying took place long before the invention of comfortable ergonomics. The monks sat on hard wooden benches, bent over their desks in cramped, often chilly rooms. Their fingers grew numb and frostbitten during cold winters, exposed for hours as they delicately maneuvered their quills. Eyes strained desperately to see fine details by the unreliable glow of candles and oil lamps, causing headaches and sometimes permanent vision damage. Over years, many monks developed spinal deformities, hunched backs, and chronic pain, caused by the relentless hours bent in rigid posture. This physical toll was enormous, yet the spiritual dedication behind it was even greater. For these monks, copying text was not merely clerical work. It was a sacred duty, a form of prayer and worship. Each manuscript was a holy offering, a link in the chain preserving the wisdom of antiquity, sacred scripture, and classical knowledge. The act of copying was imbued with reverence. Mistakes were feared not only for their practical consequences, but as potential desecrations of sacred truth. Among the texts reproduced were the Bible, theological treatises, classical works by Plato and Aristotle, histories, and early scientific writings. Without these copies, much of ancient knowledge might have been lost forever to time and turmoil. Monastic scribes became the silent custodians of Western civilization's intellectual heritage, preserving the written word through centuries of conflict, ignorance, and decay. The conditions in which they worked underscore the incredible human cost behind these cultural treasures. Candlelight flickered against parchment as the hours dragged on, the soft scratching sound of quills mingling with the chill silence. The monks' fingers bled from constant pen pressure and the abrasive texture of parchment. They dipped their quills repeatedly in ink that sometimes smudged, threatening hours of labor to be lost. The strain on their eyes was relentless, for even the slightest slip could result in illegibility, necessitating erasure or worse, the destruction of an entire page. Beyond physical pain, there was a mental endurance required to maintain concentration for hours on end. The repetitive nature of the task was hypnotic, and monotony could lead to mistakes. To counter this, monks would sometimes chant or meditate as they worked, merging the act of copying with their spiritual rituals. The scriptorium was thus a space of both suffering and sanctity. One must imagine the cumulative effect of decades spent in such conditions. Many monks began their service as young men, entering the monastery with zeal and strength, only to emerge years later with worn hands, strained eyes, and bodies marked by years of toil. Yet the passion for preservation, for knowledge, and for faith drove them onward. Their painstaking work laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the eventual spread of printed books. The manuscripts they copied by hand became models for early printed texts, bridging the medieval world and the modern age. Without their sacrifice, much of what we consider foundational knowledge today might have vanished. This history compels us to appreciate the unseen labor behind every ancient text, every page turned with reverence in museums and libraries. Behind the beauty and wisdom lies a story of relentless dedication, physical pain, and unwavering faith. The monks who copied books until their fingers bled were not merely scribes. They were warriors in a silent battle against the erasure of human knowledge. Their legacy is etched not only in ink on parchment, but in the very survival of culture itself. As we reflect on their lives, we are reminded of the profound connection between sacrifice and preservation, between suffering and enlightenment. In the cold glow of the scriptorium's candlelight, history was written, not just on pages, but into the enduring spirit of humanity. The monks who were beaten for falling asleep during prayer. Exhaustion and malnourishment defined the brutal reality for monks who dared to succumb to the weariness that overtook them during the endless Latin prayers of their daily lives. In the austere world of medieval monasticism, falling asleep was not simply a momentary lapse, but a grave transgression against discipline, devotion, and obedience. The monks were expected to maintain unwavering vigilance throughout hours of chanting, psalms, and ritual, even when their bodies begged for rest. To nod off during prayer was to betray not only oneself, but the sacred order they served. Under the strict rules that govern monastic life, especially within Benedictine and other rigorous orders, sleepiness during prayer was met with harsh punishment. Rods and lashings were commonly used to physically jolt the offending monk awake, a painful reminder of the spiritual and communal obligation to remain alert. The lash was both disciplinary and symbolic. It was intended to purify, to restore focus, and to prevent the spiritual slippage that might arise from physical weakness. The fasting orders imposed as further punishment only deepened the suffering. Starvation already gnawed at their bodies due to the meager diet monastic life demanded, designed to cultivate humility and resist earthly pleasures. Being ordered to fast more severely after falling asleep created a vicious cycle. Weakness led to punishment, which led to further weakness. This interplay of physical deprivation and strict discipline shaped a daily existence where the body was continually tested and broken down for the sake of spiritual purity. Long Latin prayers themselves were demanding rituals. The divine office required the chanting or recitation of psalms, hymns, and scripture at set hours throughout the day and night. These prayers, often lasting hours, were conducted in Latin, a language that many monks may have spoken, but that required sustained concentration to perform properly. The ritual was designed to transform time itself into a continuous act of worship, binding the community in a shared rhythm of praise and submission. Yet, for exhausted monks, the length and repetitiveness of these prayers could overwhelm the senses and drag the mind toward unconsciousness. The physical environment compounded the challenge. Monastic cells were small, austere, and cold, offering little comfort. Many monks faced harsh winters without adequate heating, and their diets lacked sufficient calories and nutrients. Sleep was fragmented by the monastic schedule, with multiple wake-up calls during the night for prayer and work. Chronic fatigue became an ever-present shadow, eroding both health and morale. In such a context, staying awake was not just a test of will, but a near-impossible demand. The punishments for falling asleep were also reflections of the monastic worldview. Vigilance in prayer was equated with spiritual readiness and moral purity. To doze was to invite temptation, sin, and the weakening of the soul's connection to God. Discipline, often harsh by modern standards, was justified as a necessary means to maintain the community's spiritual integrity. Pain and deprivation were accepted as paths to holiness, tools to overcome the flesh and its weaknesses. Historical records reveal that these punishments were not mere anecdotes but common practices in many monastic communities. Chronicles, letters, and monastic rules speak of the severity with which sleep during prayer was treated. Some orders even formalized these penalties in their statutes, outlining specific sanctions for lapses in attention. This institutionalization reflects how central the ideal of perpetual prayer and wakefulness was to medieval monastic life. Yet beneath this severity lay a paradox. The monks, while harshly punished for sleep, were themselves human, fragile, and vulnerable to exhaustion. Their bodies rebelled against the impossible demands placed upon them. This tension between human limitation and religious ideal is a haunting theme of monastic history, revealing how discipline could both sustain and devastate those who sought spiritual perfection. The legacy of these punishments speaks to broader questions about the cost of religious zeal and the human cost of institutionalized austerity. It invites reflection on how systems of belief can transform natural needs into moral failures and how suffering is sometimes sanctified in the pursuit of holiness. The image of monks lashed awake, starved further, and pushed beyond endurance is a powerful testimony to the extremes of medieval spirituality and discipline. In understanding this harsh chapter of monastic life, we see not only the cruelty, but also the complexity of a world where devotion demanded total surrender, even to the point of breaking the body and mind. The monks who endured beatings for falling asleep remind us that spiritual discipline was inseparable from physical hardship, and that the quest for holiness was often a journey marked by pain, endurance, and sacrifice beyond what modern sensibilities can easily comprehend. Their story is a testament to the fierce commitment and suffering that shaped medieval monasticism, a vivid reminder of a time when the silence of prayer was punctuated not just by sacred words, but by the crack of the rod and the pangs of hunger. It challenges us to reconsider the nature of faith, discipline, and the human limits tested in the shadows of devotion. The time a monk was excommunicated for eating cheese. In the rigid and meticulously ordered world of medieval monastic life, even the smallest breach of discipline could carry grave consequences. Among the many strict rules that monks lived by, the regulations governing fasting were some of the most complex and exacting. Fasting was not simply abstaining from food. It was a spiritual exercise deeply embedded in the rhythm of monastic devotion, designed to discipline the body and elevate the soul. To violate these fasting rules, even unintentionally, was to threaten the sacred order of the community and the monk's own spiritual journey. One of the more striking examples of this severity comes from the story of a monk who was excommunicated for the seemingly minor act of eating cheese on a forbidden day. A violation so serious that it led to his exile from the monastery. The monastic calendar was filled with specific days dedicated to fasting and abstinence, often delineated with painstaking detail. Certain days forbade the consumption of meat, dairy, eggs, and other rich foods, each rule carefully observed to maintain purity and penance. The rule of Saint Benedict and other monastic guidelines laid out these regulations not merely as dietary laws, but as spiritual disciplines, acts of obedience, humility, and self-denial. For monks, Breaking these rules was tantamount to breaking a sacred vow. The body was seen as a temple that must be kept pure, and the food consumed was a reflection of that purity or impurity. In this austere context, the consumption of cheese on a day when dairy was forbidden was no trivial matter. Cheese, a staple in many medieval diets, was considered a rich food, and its consumption was strictly regulated during fasting periods. The rules could be complex, with different fast days varying across seasons and religious calendars. The monk who ate cheese on a forbidden day committed a breach of this carefully maintained order, disrupting not only his own discipline but the communal harmony and sacred rhythm of the monastery. The punishment for this violation was severe and dramatic: excommunication, a form of spiritual and social exile. To be excommunicated was to be cast out from the body of the church, deprived of the sacraments and the fellowship of the monastic community. It was a profound statement of disapproval, marking the offender as spiritually impure and morally errant. This punishment was meant not only to correct but to purify, compelling the monk to reflect deeply on his transgression and to seek repentance. Excommunication was no light matter. It severed the monk from the very community that had nurtured his spiritual growth and provided his daily sustenance and purpose. The psychological impact must have been immense. The monastery was not just a place to live, it was a sacred home, a center of identity and belonging. Being cut off from it meant facing profound isolation and uncertainty. The monk's exile was a stark reminder of the strictness with which monastic discipline was enforced and the high cost of even small failures. This incident also reveals the intense social and religious control exercised within monastic life. Food was not simply nourishment, it was a matter of obedience and submission to divine law. The meticulous rules around fasting underscored the belief that spiritual purity required constant vigilance, and any lapse, however small, was a threat to the sacred order. The punishment for eating cheese on a forbidden day, severe though it was, served to reinforce the communal commitment to these ideals and deter others from similar transgressions. Moreover, this story highlights the complexity and severity of monastic discipline, where even seemingly mundane actions were charged with spiritual significance. The monks' lives were a continuous balancing act of obedience, self-control, and devotion. Every act, every choice was scrutinized through the lens of holiness. The eating of cheese, an everyday act outside the monastery, became in this context a transgression that warranted exile. In the broader medieval Christian world, such strict fasting rules were common, but monasteries were the centers where these rules were most rigorously interpreted and enforced. The stakes were high because the monks were viewed as spiritual warriors, engaged in a lifelong battle against sin and temptation. Their strict adherence to fasting was a form of spiritual armor, a way to discipline the flesh and open the soul to divine grace. The excommunication of a monk for a single act of eating cheese reminds us just how intensely this battle was fought, and how every detail of life was brought under the gaze of religious authority. Ultimately, the story of the monk punished for eating cheese on the wrong day serves as a powerful illustration of the uncompromising nature of medieval monasticism. It shows us a world where the sacred and the mundane were inseparably intertwined, where every act was a test of faith and obedience, and where the consequences of failure were harsh and immediate. This tale challenges our modern sensibilities and invites us to reflect on the profound depths of commitment, discipline, and belief that shaped the lives of those who chose to walk the monastic path. The monastery that was attacked by Vikings twice, Lindisfarne Abbey, an isolated sanctuary perched on the windswept northeastern coast of England, stands at the very crossroads of history and legend, a place where the sacred met the savage in a brutal collision that would echo through centuries. In the year 793, this small monastic island became the first target of the Viking Age's devastating raids, a violent awakening that shattered the fragile peace of medieval Christendom and changed the course of European history forever. The story of Lindisfarne is not merely about a monastery being attacked, it is a chilling tale of cultural shock, spiritual upheaval, and the relentless forces of a new era crashing into the old world. To understand why Lindisfarne was chosen and why the attack was so harrowing, we must first look at the abbey itself. Founded in 635 AD by St. Aidan, Lindisfarne was a beacon of Christian learning and piety. Its monks were dedicated scribes and scholars, painstakingly copying manuscripts and preserving knowledge in an age darkened by turmoil. The abbey housed precious relics and treasures that symbolized the spiritual heart of the region. Its location, somewhat remote yet accessible, made it a center of pilgrimage and a hub for spreading Christianity into the wild lands of Northumbria and beyond. But this sacred haven was vulnerable. The Vikings, fierce seafarers from Scandinavia, had mastered the art of swift surprise attacks by sea, using their longships to strike with terrifying precision. The raid on Lindisfarne was not a random act of banditry. It was a calculated assault that announced the arrival of a new, merciless threat to the Christian West. On June 8, 793, the Norse warriors descended upon the abbey, slaughtering monks, enslaving survivors, and plundering its riches. Eyewitness accounts from the time, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the writings of Alcuin of York, describe the horror with vivid sorrow. Not long after the fierce heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne, terror and murder overwhelmed the people everywhere. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves across Europe. For the people of the British Isles, the sacredness of monasteries was sacrosanct, places of peace, prayer, and sanctuary. The desecration of Lindisfarne was a spiritual earthquake. It challenged the sense of divine protection and forced kingdoms to confront a new kind of warfare, one fueled not just by political ambition, but by raw pagan ferocity. Yet, the story of Lindisfarne does not end with its first sacking. The Vikings returned again years later, as the Norse expansion intensified and their raids became more frequent and sophisticated. The abbey, despite being rebuilt and reinforced, could not escape the relentless tide of Viking violence. Monks were again slaughtered or taken into slavery, relics stolen or destroyed, the very fabric of the Christian community torn apart. The repeated attacks on Lindisfarne reveal a deeper historical pattern. The Viking raids were more than mere plunder. They were part of a seismic cultural and political transformation. The Norse invaders brought new ideas, new governance, and eventually new religions that mingled with existing traditions. They disrupted old trade routes and political structures, but also laid foundations for future kingdoms and states. The scars of their raids marked the end of an era of relative isolation and the dawn of the medieval age's more interconnected and tumultuous world. Moreover, the aftermath of Lindisfarne influenced how Europe perceived and responded to external threats. It spurred the development of coastal defenses, military reforms, and a new urgency in uniting fragmented kingdoms against common foes. The raid was not just a violent episode, it was a catalyst that shaped medieval identity and resilience. But beneath the historical facts lies the human tragedy. Monks who had devoted their lives to prayer and scholarship were violently uprooted. Their sacred sanctuary turned into a battlefield. Manuscripts painstakingly copied, containing centuries of knowledge, were lost or destroyed. The echoes of their cries and the clashing of sword and shield still resonate through time, a haunting reminder of how fragile civilization can be in the face of relentless upheaval. Today, the ruins of Lindisfarne Abbey stand as a silent testament to that violent collision of worlds. The stones whisper stories of faith, destruction, survival, and transformation. Archaeological finds reveal layers of destruction and rebuilding, symbolizing both the brutality endured and the enduring spirit of those who once lived there. In telling the story of Lindisfarne, we glimpse the raw reality behind the grand narratives of history, the fears and hopes, the faith and ferocity, the fragility of peace, and the permanence of change. It reminds us that history is never simply about dates and events, but about the lives caught in the tides of an ever-changing world. The Viking attacks on Lindisfarne Abbey were a dark prologue to the tumultuous centuries that followed, a violent rupture that forever altered the spiritual and political landscape of medieval Europe. As we reflect on Lindisfarne's fate, we are compelled to consider the enduring tension between sanctuary and siege, faith and fury, preservation and destruction, a tension that has defined human history across ages and continents. The monastery that was attacked by Vikings twice is not just a story of devastation. It is a powerful emblem of resilience, transformation, and the haunting beauty of survival amid chaos. The monks who dug graves. Every day to prepare for death. In the austere world of medieval monasticism, life was shaped by rituals meant to bring monks closer to spiritual purity and constant awareness of their mortality. Among the most profound and haunting of these practices was the daily task of digging a grave. This was not simply manual labor. It was a stark physical reminder of death, a meditation made flesh that forced monks to confront the inevitable end awaiting them all. The practice emerged from the deeply ingrained Christian tradition of memento mori, which means, remember that you must die. This concept wasn't an abstract idea, but a daily lived reality within monastic communities. By digging graves every day, monks transformed the fear and mystery of death into a tangible experience. Each shovelful of earth they moved was a solemn reminder that life is fleeting, and the soul must prepare for its journey beyond the mortal realm. In some strict orders, such as certain Benedictine and Carthusian communities, this ritual took on even more intense forms. Some monks were assigned to dig their own graves, or at least the graves where they knew they would one day be laid to rest. This intimate connection with their mortality was a spiritual exercise in humility and acceptance. The grave was both a physical place and a symbol, the ultimate equalizer that erased worldly distinctions, reducing every man to earth and dust. The physical labor involved was harsh and demanding, a form of penance and devotion. Using simple tools, often in cold or harsh weather, monks worked silently, their thoughts focused on prayers, scripture, and reflections on death and judgment. This repetitive task instilled in them a disciplined mindset. Death was not a distant event, but an ever-present reality, demanding readiness and spiritual vigilance. This daily confrontation with death shaped monastic identity profoundly. It cultivated detachment from material things and ego, reinforcing the belief that earthly life is temporary and that only the soul's salvation truly matters. By digging graves, monks kept mortality ever before their eyes, a somber but necessary awareness that gave meaning and urgency to their prayers and ascetic practices. The psychological impact of this ritual was significant. Facing the reality of death so directly every day helped monks overcome fear and denial. It fostered a serene acceptance, a readiness to meet the end without panic or resistance. Rather than being morbid, this practice was a powerful tool for spiritual growth, reminding monks to live humbly, to repent sincerely, and to seek divine grace earnestly. Historically, grave digging by monks also reflected the medieval worldview where death was a central preoccupation. The plague, wars, and hardships made mortality a daily concern for all. Monastic communities dedicated to contemplation and preparation for the afterlife embodied this awareness in their daily lives through rituals like grave digging. Some records suggest that monks would even personalize these graves with symbols or simple markers, acknowledging the close link between their daily labor and their own fate. This practice transformed a grim chore into a sacred act, blending physical work with deep spiritual meaning. Today, this monastic discipline offers a profound lesson. It reminds us that awareness of death can be a powerful catalyst for living meaningfully. The monks who dug graves every day were not morbid souls, but individuals seeking to embrace life's impermanence fully, turning labor into prayer and death into a daily teacher. This is the story of monks who wielded shovels as instruments of meditation, carving not just graves but pathways to humility, acceptance, and spiritual awakening. Their daily labor was a sacred dialogue with mortality, a ritual that made death an ever-present companion on the path to eternal life. The rule that forced monks to confess every thought. Imagine a life where every fleeting thought, every secret whisper of the mind is laid bare before another human being, where even the most private doubts, desires, or distractions are confessed openly, scrutinized, and judged. In certain medieval monastic orders, this was not a hypothetical exercise, but a strict daily requirement. Monks were compelled to confess not only their sins, but every impure or worldly thought to their abbot or spiritual superior. This rule, designed to maintain spiritual purity and communal discipline, created a world of extreme vulnerability and psychological intensity, revealing the powerful and sometimes terrifying control exerted within monastic life. Medieval monasticism was governed by detailed rules aiming to shape every aspect of a monk's existence, body, mind, and soul. Among these, the demand for complete transparency over one's thoughts was one of the most intrusive and demanding. Rooted in the fear of sin, heresy, and moral weakness, this practice was meant to purify the individual and protect the community from spiritual contamination. The human mind was seen as a battleground where evil and temptation constantly waged war, and unchecked impure thoughts could lead to moral ruin. The abbot, as the spiritual authority, acted as judge, confessor, and guide. The daily confession of thoughts was a ritualized form of self-examination and accountability. Monks were expected to confess not only concrete actions, but the intangible landscape of their inner life, their anxieties, fantasies, doubts, and fleeting lapses of faith. This unrelenting scrutiny created a culture of self-surveillance, where monks learned to monitor and control their minds rigorously, fearing both internal failure and external punishment. Failing to confess a forbidden thought was not a minor lapse. It could lead to severe disciplinary measures, ranging from penances like fasting and isolation to public humiliation or suspicion of heresy, which was the gravest charge in medieval Christendom. The fear of being accused of hiding impure thoughts fostered an atmosphere of anxiety, and confession became a psychological prison as much as a spiritual practice. This rule reflected a profound belief about the nature of sin and salvation. Medieval spirituality emphasized the necessity of rooting out sin at its source, the mind, not merely addressing outward behavior. Thoughts were believed to have power. They could shape the soul's destiny. By confessing thoughts daily, monks sought to purify their souls continuously, preventing sin from taking root and spreading. Yet, this practice also exposed the vulnerabilities and contradictions of the human psyche. The constant demand for confession could deepen feelings of guilt and self-doubt, paradoxically reinforcing the very impure thoughts it sought to eliminate. The relentless focus on inner life sometimes led to spiritual despair or obsessive introspection, where monks became trapped in cycles of confession and anxiety. Historical records and monastic writings describe the intense psychological burden this rule imposed. Some monks struggled to find relief in confession, while others sought to evade it or minimize their faults, risking punishment. The abbot's role was pivotal. His judgment could offer mercy or harshness, guidance or condemnation. This dynamic created a delicate balance of power within the monastery. The practice of daily confession of thoughts also shaped monastic community life. Transparency was intended to foster trust and spiritual solidarity, but it often bred suspicion and fear. Monks became watchful of their own minds and wary of their brothers, aware that any secret thought could become cause for discipline or ostracism. This rule must be understood within the broader context of medieval religion, where salvation was a constant concern, and the battle against sin was fierce and unending. The medieval mind viewed the soul's purity as fragile, under siege from both internal temptations and external threats. The rigorous confession regimen was part of a comprehensive spiritual armor designed to defend against these dangers. The demand to confess every thought highlights the profound tension between spiritual aspiration and human imperfection. It reveals the medieval monastic ideal of perfect holiness, where nothing, not even the most fleeting mental image, could be hidden from God's gaze as mediated through the abbot. Reflecting on this practice today, we recognize its intensity and its cost. It challenges our modern notions of privacy, mental health, and spirituality. The monk's relentless self-scrutiny speaks to a deep yearning for purity and transcendence, but also to the harsh realities of a system that valued conformity and control over psychological freedom. The rule that forced monks to confess every thought was a profound exercise in discipline and vulnerability. It forged men who lived with an unyielding awareness of their inner lives, subjected to both divine judgment and human authority. Their lives were a testament to the extremes of faith and the complex interplay between confession, control, and redemption. The abbot who starved his monks to enforce discipline. In the harsh world of medieval monasticism, discipline was often enforced not only through prayer and labor, but also through the relentless control of the body's most basic needs: food and sustenance. Among the many severe practices employed by abbots to instill humility and obedience, one of the most extreme was the deliberate starvation of monks under their care. Historical records reveal chilling accounts of abbots who reduced food rations drastically, or worse, served spoiled and rotten bread as a means to enforce discipline and spiritual purity within the monastic community. This practice must be understood within the broader context of monastic life, governed by strict ascetic principles. The rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped much of Western monasticism, emphasized poverty, self-denial, and the mortification of the flesh. Food was never considered a pleasure, but a necessary fuel to sustain the body in its service to God. Excess or indulgence was seen as a dangerous path leading away from humility and into temptation. Starvation and extreme fasting, therefore, were tools to purify the soul, to remind monks that their allegiance was to God rather than earthly comforts. The role of the abbot was pivotal in this dynamic. As the spiritual and administrative head of a monastery, the abbot wielded significant authority over the monks' daily lives, including their diets. In times of perceived laxity or moral failure, abbots sometimes resorted to harsh measures, believing that physical suffering would lead to spiritual renewal. Food ration cuts were not merely about scarcity. They were a deliberate imposition of hardship designed to break pride and enforce obedience. Serving rotten or moldy bread was an even more severe punishment and form of discipline. Bread, the staple of the monastic diet, was expected to be simple but nourishing. To force monks to consume spoiled bread was to heighten their suffering and remind them of their earthly frailty and dependence on divine grace. This practice reflected a worldview that embraced suffering as a pathway to sanctity, a form of ascetic discipline that sought to conquer the desires of the flesh and redirect the monk's focus toward spiritual matters. The physiological consequences of such starvation and spoiled food consumption were grave. Malnutrition, weakened immunity, and chronic illness plagued monastic communities that endured these extreme diets. Yet the monks accepted these hardships as part of their spiritual journey, often interpreting physical suffering as a form of penance that cleansed their souls of sin. The abbot's authority to impose such suffering was rarely questioned, as obedience was paramount in the hierarchical structure of monastic life. Historical chronicles and letters from the medieval period provide evidence of these practices. Some abbots were notorious for their severity, their names recorded in monastic annals as examples of harsh discipline. These accounts often describe periods of famine or scandal that prompted abbots to tighten control over food supplies, but there are also documented cases where starvation was used proactively as a spiritual tool, rather than simply a response to external scarcity. The psychological impact on the monks was profound. Living under constant threat of hunger and forced consumption of unfit food created an atmosphere of fear and submission. Yet, paradoxically, this fear was intertwined with a deep commitment to the monastic vocation and the pursuit of holiness. The monks' endurance of starvation and suffering was seen as evidence of their devotion and spiritual strength. Such severe disciplinary practices illuminate the complex relationship between power, spirituality, and the body in medieval monasticism. The abbot's role was not only to guide souls, but to control bodies, often through brutal means. The starvation of monks underscores how ascetic ideals could be manipulated into instruments of control and coercion, blurring the line between spiritual discipline and physical abuse. Reflecting on this grim aspect of monastic history forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the cost of religious zeal and institutional authority. How far should discipline extend when it endangers human health? What does it mean to submit to a spiritual authority that controls even the most basic human needs? The story of the abbot who starved his monks challenges modern assumptions about faith and discipline, revealing a world where obedience was enforced through pain and deprivation. Ultimately, these historical realities serve as a powerful reminder of the extremes to which human devotion and institutional power can reach. The starving monks, forced to endure hunger and rot in the name of humility, bear witness to a time when the body was a battleground for the soul and survival itself became a form of spiritual trial. This legacy compels us to rethink the nature of discipline, compassion, and the human limits tested in the pursuit of holiness. The monks who whipped themselves until they fainted. Flagellation, the practice of whipping oneself until blood flowed and the body was raw, was a deeply intense form of spiritual discipline embraced by many monks during the medieval period, especially during Lent and other penance rituals. This extreme act of self-punishment was not born of masochism, but of a profound theological conviction that physical suffering could purify the soul, cleanse sin, and bring one closer to Christ's own passion and sacrifice. To understand the staggering dedication behind this brutal practice, we must delve into the religious mindset that made flagellation a sacred and sometimes overwhelming experience, one that pushed monks to the limits of human endurance, often causing them to faint from blood loss. The roots of self-flagellation are ancient, intertwined with Christian ideas of penitence and mortification of the flesh. In medieval monasticism, the body was seen both as a vessel for the soul and as a source of temptation and sin. To discipline the body harshly was to discipline the spirit, to force the flesh into submission so that the soul might rise in holiness. This philosophy was deeply influenced by the Passion of Christ, who suffered excruciating pain for humanity's salvation. By imitating Christ's suffering through self-inflicted pain, monks believed they could participate more fully in divine redemption. During Lent, a season marked by fasting, prayer, and penitence, flagellation took on particular importance. It was a physical manifestation of repentance, a way for monks to atone for their sins and to prepare themselves spiritually for Easter. In some monasteries, flagellation was a communal ritual, with monks gathering to whip themselves in unison under the guidance of their abbot or spiritual leader. The whipping was methodical and rigorous, often continuing until the flesh was bruised and bleeding, until the pain overwhelmed the senses, and sometimes until the monk lost consciousness. The practice was not a random or uncontrolled display of suffering. It followed strict rules and spiritual guidelines. The whip itself, often a scourge made of knotted cords or leather strips, was designed to inflict pain without causing permanent injury. Yet, despite these precautions, the physical toll was immense. Monks often bore welts, cuts, and open wounds across their backs and shoulders, their bodies marked as signs of their devotion and penitence. The pain was accepted willingly, even embraced, as a sacred sacrifice that purified their souls and strengthened their spiritual resolve. Accounts from medieval chronicles and monastic records describe how monks would sometimes faint during these flagellation rituals, overcome by blood loss, exhaustion, and the overwhelming intensity of the pain. To observers, these fainting spells were not signs of weakness, but were often interpreted as spiritual ecstasy or as evidence of the monk's deep union with Christ's suffering. The boundary between physical agony and mystical experience blurred, creating a space where pain was transformed into a conduit for divine grace. This brutal form of penance also served a communal function. It was a visible demonstration of humility and obedience, a public acknowledgement of sin and the need for repentance. The scars and wounds borne by flagellating monks were marks of honor within the monastic community, symbols of their willingness to suffer for spiritual purification. These acts reinforced the shared identity of the monastic order as a body united in sacrifice, discipline, and devotion. Yet, the practice of flagellation was not without controversy. Some within the church questioned whether such extreme self-harm was appropriate or beneficial, warning against excess and the potential for pride in visible suffering. Nevertheless, flagellation persisted, reflecting the medieval worldview in which bodily suffering was inseparable from spiritual salvation. Beyond the monastery walls, flagellation influenced broader religious movements and popular piety. Flagellant confraternities arose, groups of laypeople who adopted self-whipping as a form of public penance, especially during times of crisis, such as plagues or wars. This phenomenon underscores the deep cultural resonance of flagellation as a means of confronting sin and seeking divine mercy. In examining the monks who whipped themselves until they fainted, we glimpse a world where faith demanded extraordinary sacrifice. Their bloodied backs and fainting bodies were living testaments to a profound belief that suffering could cleanse, heal, and transform. This practice, harsh and extreme as it was, embodied the medieval monastic ideal that through discipline, pain, and unyielding obedience, one could transcend the frailty of the flesh and approach the divine mystery of redemption. Ultimately, the self-flagellating monks stand as a stark reminder of the lengths to which human beings have gone in their quest for holiness, revealing a spiritual landscape where pain was not merely endured, but embraced as a sacred path to salvation. The winter ritual that required ice-cold baths at dawn. Imagine a dawn so cold that the very air feels sharp and biting, where the world is wrapped in frost and silence before the first light breaks the horizon. In certain medieval monasteries, monks subjected themselves to a grueling ritual, ice-cold baths taken in the dead of night or at the earliest hint of dawn. This was not a mere act of cleansing, but a profound spiritual discipline, one that demanded endurance, humility, and an unwavering commitment to faith. It was a ritual that challenged the boundaries between body and spirit, a daily test of willpower that carried deep symbolic weight. The origins of this practice lie in the austere traditions of monasticism, where physical hardship was embraced as a path to spiritual purity and enlightenment. Monks believed that by subjecting their bodies to extreme discomfort, they could transcend earthly desires and distractions, drawing closer to God. The icy baths were a tangible expression of this belief, a deliberate confrontation with nature's harshness, a purification not only of the body, but of the soul. The ritual was especially severe in northern monasteries, where winters were brutal and snowstorms common. Imagine monks rising before dawn, sometimes in pitch darkness, and entering cold water sources such as rivers, pools, or specially constructed stone basins. The water was often near freezing, and there was no respite. After immersion, they could not light fires to warm themselves, intensifying the physical ordeal. The cold bit into their skin, seizing muscles and chilling to the bone. Yet the monks endured in silence and prayer. This ritual was closely linked to the monastic schedule of the divine office, the cycle of prayers marking the day and night. The cold baths preceded the early morning prayers, vigils, or matins, which were themselves an act of devotion performed at hours when most of the world still slept. The practice reinforced discipline and vigilance, waking the monks from sleep and preparing them mentally and physically to face the sacred duties ahead. The significance of the icy bath extended beyond mere asceticism. Water has long held powerful symbolic meaning in Christianity. It is both cleansing and life-giving, a metaphor for baptism and spiritual renewal. By immersing themselves in cold water, monks enacted a daily baptism of sorts, washing away sin, temptation, and the frailties of the flesh. The cold water was a reminder of mortality and the trials of the early Christian martyrs who endured suffering for their faith. Historical records and monastic rules, such as those by Saint Benedict, offer glimpses into the seriousness of such practices. Though Saint Benedict's rule does not explicitly command ice baths, It advocates for moderation in fasting and physical discipline. Over time, various monastic communities adopted more extreme versions of bodily mortification influenced by desert fathers and other ascetic traditions. The icy bath was one of these harsher rites, reflecting a broader medieval obsession with penance and the purification of the self through suffering. Yet, this practice was not without danger. Prolonged exposure to cold, especially without warming afterward, risked hypothermia and illness. It demanded exceptional physical resilience and mental fortitude. This severity underscored the monks' commitment to their spiritual path, choosing discomfort over comfort, sacrifice over ease. The ritual also reinforced communal bonds within the monastery. Enduring the cold together, sharing in hardship, fostered a profound sense of unity and mutual support. It was a collective affirmation of faith and discipline, a physical manifestation of the monastic vow to renounce worldly pleasures and submit to a higher order. In reflecting on this winter ritual, we glimpse the intense and often brutal reality of monastic life, a world far removed from serene cloisters and peaceful chants. It was a life where the body was constantly tested and the spirit forged in fire and ice alike. The cold bath at dawn was more than a habit. It was a daily rite of passage, a profound spiritual act connecting the monks to their faith, their community, and the natural world in its most raw and elemental form. This practice invites us to consider the extremes of devotion and the complex ways in which physical hardship has been intertwined with spiritual growth throughout history. It challenges modern notions of comfort and faith, revealing a medieval mindset where suffering was a pathway to holiness, and the icy waters of dawn baptism were a call to awaken body, mind, and soul to the divine. The forbidden feeling that got a monk banished forever. In the austere world of medieval monasticism, the pursuit of spiritual perfection was governed by strict rules and an unwavering commitment to solemnity. Every action, every word, and every feeling was carefully regulated to maintain a sacred atmosphere conducive to divine contemplation. In such an environment, joy and humor were often viewed not as blessings, but as dangerous distractions that could lead the soul astray. It is within this rigid framework that one of the most profound and tragic episodes unfolded, the story of a monk who was banished forever for a single, forbidden feeling: laughter. Monastic life was designed to be a continuous meditation on the divine, a relentless suppression of worldly desires and emotions. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided countless monasteries across medieval Europe, emphasized silence, humility, and restraint. Joy was not condemned outright, but frivolity and laughter were closely monitored and often suppressed, especially during solemn rituals such as scripture readings and prayers. The spiritual ideal demanded a solemnity that left no room for lightheartedness or emotional excess. Within this austere context, the story of the banished monk serves as a stark illustration of the tension between human nature and religious discipline. During a solemn reading of sacred texts, a moment meant to inspire reverence and focused contemplation, this monk succumbed to an uncontrollable burst of laughter. The exact cause of his laughter is lost to history. Some speculate it was a reaction to an unexpected or ironic phrase. Others suggest it was a sudden, involuntary release of tension. Regardless, the act was perceived as a grave breach of monastic decorum. Laughter in the monastery was not a harmless expression, but a symbol of distraction, levity, and a potential descent into sin. It broke the chain of solemnity that held the community together in shared reverence. For the abbot and fellow monks, this outburst threatened the spiritual integrity of the entire order. The banishment was swift and irrevocable, a punishment not just for the act, but for the perceived spiritual failing it represented. The monk's expulsion was a fate worse than death within monastic society. To be cast out meant the loss of one's spiritual home, the severing of sacred bonds, and the condemnation to live outside the protective walls of the cloistered world. It was an exile not only from community, but from the sacred pursuit that defined his very identity. This harsh response underscores the severity with which monastic institutions viewed any disruption to their strict spiritual regimen. This event reveals the profound struggle monks faced between natural human emotions and the rigorous demands of their vocation. While monasticism sought to transcend the earthly and the emotional, monks remained human, subject to the complexities of joy, sorrow, laughter, and pain. The forbidden laughter was a moment when the monk's humanity clashed painfully with the inhuman expectations of his order. Beyond the personal tragedy, this story offers a window into medieval religious culture, where control over the body and emotions was seen as essential to salvation. Laughter was feared because it could unravel the delicate fabric of spiritual discipline, opening the door to temptation, distraction, and ultimately sin. It was not merely an emotional reaction, but a spiritual threat. This harsh judgment on laughter also reflects broader medieval attitudes toward humor and joy, which were often circumscribed by religious doctrine. While celebrations and festivals allowed for some expressions of mirth, the everyday life of a monk was to be marked by sobriety and seriousness. The monk's laughter transgressed the boundary between acceptable joy and forbidden levity, crossing into territory that monastic law could not tolerate. The banishment of the laughing monk invites reflection on the delicate balance between discipline and compassion, between the human and the divine. It challenges us to consider how spiritual pursuits can sometimes clash with the natural impulses that make us human. How do we honor both the quest for holiness and the fullness of human experience, including joy and laughter? This story, though harsh and tragic, reminds us that even in the most rigid systems, the spark of humanity can flare unexpectedly. The monk's forbidden laughter was a brief but powerful assertion of life, a momentary breaking free from the chains of solemnity. Though punished severely, his laughter echoes through history as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the end, the monk who was banished for laughter teaches us about the costs of extreme discipline and the vital role of joy in the human soul. His story is a haunting reminder that to be truly alive is to embrace the full spectrum of emotions, even those deemed forbidden by the strictest rules. This is the tale of a monk who dared to laugh in the face of silence and solemnity, and for that moment of forbidden joy was cast out forever from the sacred world he once called home. The monks who ate bread made of ground tree bark. Imagine a monastery in the grip of famine, fields barren, grain stores exhausted, and the threat of starvation looming over the community. Yet within these austere stone walls, monks faced a grim choice: surrender to hunger or survive by turning to the most desperate of measures. During times of scarcity, these monks resorted to baking bread made from ground tree bark and roots, an act of survival so harsh it tested their endurance and faith. What makes this story even more compelling is that, despite their own starvation, the monks continued to share what little they had, feeding the poor, and even nobility from the monastery's reserves. This paradox of sacrifice and charity reveals the profound spirit and resilience of medieval monastic life. Medieval Europe was no stranger to famine. Crop failures, war, and harsh winters often led to devastating food shortages. Monasteries, as centers of sustenance and charity, were both victims and responders to these crises. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided many monastic communities, emphasized hospitality and aid to the needy as a sacred duty. Yet, when famine struck, even the monks struggled to survive. In such desperate times, traditional bread, made from wheat or rye, became scarce or impossible to produce. The ingenious and grim solution was to turn to the forest itself. Tree bark, especially the inner cambium layer beneath the rough outer bark, could be dried, ground into a coarse flour, and mixed with whatever meager grain remained. Roots, such as those from dandelions or other hardy plants, were harvested and incorporated to stretch the flour further. This bark bread was far from the wholesome loaves we imagine. It was dense, bitter, and difficult to digest. Nutritionally poor, it lacked the calories and sustenance of real grain bread, often causing digestive issues. Yet it was a lifeline, a way to stave off starvation when all else failed. The physical hardship of eating bark bread was compounded by the psychological toll, the stark reminder of scarcity and suffering. What elevates this story beyond mere survival is the monks' unwavering commitment to charity. Despite their own hunger and the meager quality of their food, monasteries continued to distribute food to the poor who sought help at their doors. They maintained their role as caretakers of the vulnerable and providers of hospitality, even as they lived on bark bread themselves. Nobles and local lords reliant on the monastery stores were also fed, reflecting the complex social relationships between religious institutions and medieval society. Historical accounts and monastic chronicles attest to this practice, revealing the monks' resilience and self-sacrifice. The bark bread became a symbol of endurance, humility, and faith. It underscored the harsh realities of medieval life, where survival often demanded turning to nature's most unlikely provisions. This practice also highlights the ingenuity and resourcefulness of monastic communities. Their deep knowledge of plants and the natural world enabled them to identify and process tree bark and roots into edible flour, a skill born of necessity but refined through experience. In some regions, certain types of bark were preferred for their relative palatability or nutritional content, showing that this was not a last-minute improvisation but a known survival technique. The social and spiritual implications were profound. Eating bark bread was a daily reminder of mortality, human fragility, and dependence on God's providence. It reinforced monastic values of poverty, simplicity, and detachment from earthly comforts. The act of sharing their scarce resources, even when reduced to bark bread, was an expression of charity that embodied the core Christian ideals of compassion and selflessness. Yet this practice was not sustainable long-term. Prolonged reliance on bark bread led to malnutrition and weakened bodies, making communities vulnerable to disease and death. Eventually, with the return of better harvests or aid, monasteries resumed more normal diets. Still, the memory of those harsh days remained etched in monastic history and lore. Reflecting on the monks who ate bread made of ground tree bark invites us to contemplate resilience in the face of adversity, the meaning of sacrifice, and the enduring human spirit. Their story is a testament to how faith and charity can persist even in the direst circumstances, turning hardship into a shared journey of survival and hope. As the monks broke their coarse, bitter bread each day, they were reminded not only of their own suffering, but of their sacred duty to serve others. Their bark bread was more than sustenance. It was a symbol of endurance, humility, and unwavering commitment to a higher calling. The library fire that destroyed a monk's life work. Imagine dedicating an entire decade of your life to painstakingly copying, illuminating, and preserving knowledge by hand, each page a labor of devotion, each letter inscribed with trembling care. For medieval monks, the scriptorium was more than just a workspace. It was a sacred arena where faith, scholarship, and artistry merged into acts of divine service. Yet in a devastating twist of fate, one such monk's life's work, an entire manuscript painstakingly compiled over 10 years, was utterly consumed by flames in a catastrophic fire that swept through the monastery's library. This tragic loss was not merely of parchment and ink, but of countless hours of prayer, intellect, and hope, and the monk who suffered this ruin died shortly afterward, broken by grief and exhaustion. The scriptorium in medieval monasteries was the heart of literary preservation. Long before the printing press, monks were the primary scribes responsible for copying religious texts, classical works, and scientific treatises. Their task required immense concentration, unwavering patience, and painstaking precision. Manuscripts were often adorned with intricate illuminations, colorful illustrations, gold leaf, and decorative initials that transformed these books into objects of both spiritual and artistic significance. The monk who lost his manuscript would have labored under flickering candlelight for hours daily, battling eye strain and fatigue, driven by a profound sense of purpose. Library fires were among the most feared disasters in monastic life. Monasteries stored their priceless collections in wooden buildings, often heated by open flames or candles, which posed constant risks. The combination of dry parchment, ink, and fragile bindings made manuscripts highly vulnerable to fire. Once flames took hold, the destruction was swift and total. Entire libraries with centuries of accumulated knowledge could vanish in hours. The loss was not only material but cultural, erasing centuries of intellectual heritage and spiritual wisdom. For the monk, the manuscript was a manifestation of his identity and spiritual calling. To see it burned was akin to watching his own soul go up in smoke. Historical records tell us that the weight of such loss could be unbearable. Grief intertwined with the physical toll of relentless work, as many monks pushed themselves to exhaustion to complete their commissions or replace lost texts. The emotional devastation, combined with overwork and deprivation, could lead to rapid decline in health. In this particular case, the monk died shortly after the fire, a stark testament to the intimate connection between body, mind, and sacred labor. This tragedy highlights the precariousness of medieval scholarly life, where the fruits of years could be erased in moments beyond human control. It also underscores the profound dedication and vulnerability of those who devoted their lives to preserving knowledge in an era when each manuscript was unique and irreplaceable. The monk's fate serves as a haunting symbol of how fragile cultural heritage was and how the human spirit was tested by loss as much as by devotion. Beyond the personal story, such incidents contributed to the urgency that eventually led to innovations in book production and preservation. The destruction wrought by fires and other disasters became a catalyst for changes in how texts were copied, stored, and protected. Yet the loss of individual lives, like that of this grieving monk, reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge was not a detached academic endeavor, but a deeply human journey marked by sacrifice, passion, and sometimes tragedy. In remembering the monk who lost his life's work to fire, we honor not only his personal sorrow, but the countless unnamed scribes whose toils shaped the intellectual foundation of the Western world. Their fragile manuscripts were bridges between past and future, and their destruction echoes through history as a solemn reminder of the fragility of human achievement. This story is a poignant meditation on loss, perseverance, and the intimate bond between creator and creation. It reveals a time when knowledge was both a sacred trust and a vulnerable treasure carried on the shoulders of those who risked everything, sometimes even their lives, to keep the flame of learning alive in the darkness of the Middle Ages. The iron discipline that made some monks lose their minds. In the austere world of medieval monasteries, the pursuit of spiritual perfection often demanded an iron discipline so relentless that it pushed many monks beyond the limits of human endurance. This discipline was a carefully constructed regime of chronic isolation, enforced silence, rigorous rituals, and harsh punishments, all designed to shape the soul into a vessel fit for divine contemplation. But beneath the ideal of sanctity lay a harsh reality. The unyielding demands of monastic life sometimes led to mental and emotional breakdowns, with some monks losing their grip on reality. These fragile individuals were often quietly removed from the community and forgotten, their suffering a silent testament to the brutal costs of the path they had chosen. Monastic discipline was not merely about external obedience. It was an all-encompassing system aimed at total self-mastery. Monks lived within walls that separated them from the world, where solitude was both a blessing and a burden. Isolation was imposed to silence worldly distractions and focus the mind on prayer and meditation. Yet, prolonged solitude, especially when combined with enforced silence, created an intense psychological strain. The human mind, deprived of social interaction and verbal expression, can deteriorate, leading to anxiety, hallucinations, and despair. Medieval monks, bound by vows that forbade complaining or revealing their inner struggles, often suffered these effects in painful silence. The silence itself was a powerful weapon of discipline. Speech was tightly controlled. Unauthorized talking could result in severe punishment. While silence fostered contemplation, it also deprived monks of an essential human outlet, intensifying feelings of loneliness and isolation. The mind, left without the balm of social exchange, was vulnerable to unraveling. This enforced quietude, combined with the strict monotony of daily routines, hours upon hours of prayer, manual labor, and repetitive rituals, created an environment that could erode mental stability. Harsh punishments compounded the psychological toll. Penalties such as fasting, whipping, and solitary confinement were commonplace responses to even minor infractions. These punishments, meant to purify and correct, could become sources of trauma, especially when meted out relentlessly. The fear of punishment fostered constant vigilance and stress, adding to the monks' mental burden. For those already struggling, these measures could hasten their decline, trapping them in cycles of despair and fear. Monastic life demanded a level of self-denial and endurance that few outside the walls could imagine. The ideal of spiritual perfection demanded not only the silencing of the body, but also the subjugation of the mind's natural rhythms and needs. When this ideal met human fragility, the result was sometimes catastrophic. Mental breakdowns were not openly discussed. To admit such weakness could lead to further punishment or exile. Instead, monks who faltered were quietly removed from the community, sent away to other religious houses, or confined in less demanding roles, their fates largely unrecorded in the annals of history. This pattern of silent removal speaks to a broader truth about medieval monasticism. The community prized order and holiness above individual suffering. The spiritual mission overshadowed personal pain, and the institution preserved its sanctity by hiding the failures and fragilities of its members. The monks who lost their minds became invisible casualties of a system that valued discipline and obedience over psychological well-being. Yet these stories of breakdown and removal reveal the human cost behind the stoic facade of monastic discipline. They remind us that the pursuit of holiness was not a serene path, but one fraught with suffering, isolation, and the peril of losing oneself entirely. The iron discipline that forged saints and mystics also shattered many, leaving scars unseen but deeply felt. In contemplating this harsh reality, we gain a fuller understanding of medieval monastic life, not only its spiritual heights, but its profound human challenges. The monks who broke under the weight of silence, isolation, and punishment remind us that the quest for transcendence can exact a devastating toll, and that behind the walls of the monastery, the mind's fragile boundaries were often tested beyond measure. The monk who was forbidden to help his dying brother. In the austere world of medieval monasticism, personal bonds were often seen as distractions, obstacles to the singular pursuit of spiritual perfection and obedience. The monks took vows not only of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also of detachment from worldly ties, including family. Their lives were to be entirely devoted to God, severing the usual emotional attachments that bind people to one another. Yet, even within this strict framework, the human heart sometimes defied such rigid separation, as evidenced by the poignant story of a monk forbidden to help his dying brother. This tale is preserved in the annals of certain monastic orders that emphasized absolute obedience and the sublimation of personal feelings beneath the demands of communal life. According to historical records, a monk who belonged to one monastery sought permission to visit his brother, who was gravely ill in another religious house. His request was denied, not lightly but firmly, because granting it would have been seen as allowing personal affection to interfere with his sacred duties and commitments. The denial was more than a simple refusal. It was a reflection of the profound tension between human compassion and monastic discipline. Monks were expected to transcend natural inclinations and devote their entire being to God's service, forsaking even family ties. The rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped many Western monastic traditions, urged monks to regard all fellow monks as brothers and to see the monastery as their true family. Earthly blood relations were to be overshadowed by spiritual kinship, with the monastic community as the sole focus of loyalty and love. This policy had deep roots in the belief that emotional attachments could weaken a monk's resolve and distract from contemplation and obedience. The fear was that personal grief or responsibility might interfere with the rigorous schedule of prayer, work, and silence that defined monastic life. By discouraging such ties, monasteries aimed to create an environment where each individual was fully surrendered to the communal rhythm and the divine will. Yet, this denial of the monk's plea reveals a heartbreaking human cost. The bond between siblings is among the most primal and enduring of human connections, and to be barred from comforting a dying brother was a cruel and wrenching punishment. It underscores the profound sacrifices demanded by monasticism, not only in terms of external discipline, but also in the suppression of deeply rooted emotional needs. The story also highlights how monasteries wielded authority over the lives of individuals, enforcing rules that could sever even the most fundamental human connections. Permission to leave the monastery was never granted lightly. Travel was arduous and potentially dangerous, and strict controls were maintained to preserve the integrity of the monastic enclosure. Quests, like the monks, were carefully scrutinized, often denied to protect the spiritual order above all else. Historical documents, including letters and chronicles, sometimes record the anguish and isolation experienced by monks caught between their human nature and their spiritual obligations. The forbidden visit stands as a powerful symbol of this inner conflict, a monk torn between love and obedience, between brotherhood in flesh and brotherhood in faith. Beyond the personal tragedy, the incident reflects broader themes in medieval spirituality: the tension between individual desires and communal rules, the cost of holiness as conceived in the age, and the complex dynamics of authority and submission within religious life. It invites reflection on how faith can both uplift and constrain, how devotion can demand sacrifices that test the very limits of human endurance. In contemplating the monk who was forbidden to help his dying brother, we confront the stark realities of medieval monasticism, a world where the pursuit of divine union exacted a heavy toll, and where the boundaries between sacred duty and human compassion were often painfully drawn. It is a reminder that behind the serene walls of monasteries lay stories of struggle, sacrifice, and the delicate balance between faith and humanity. Ultimately, this tale deepens our understanding of the monastic experience, revealing the profound cost of renouncing the self and the world. A cost measured not only in solitude and silence, but in the painful absence of those we love most. The disease that spread through shared prayer. Mats. In the serene and devout environment of medieval monasteries, the quest for spiritual purity often stood in stark contrast with the harsh realities of daily life, especially when it came to health and hygiene. Among the many unseen enemies that plagued these holy communities was a disease that spread silently and relentlessly through one of the most sacred aspects of monastic life: shared prayer mats and robes. This overlooked vector became a breeding ground for lice, scabies, and other debilitating ailments, turning places of sanctuary into hotbeds of persistent illness. Monasteries were designed as places of prayer, contemplation, and communal living. Monks gathered frequently in close quarters, kneeling side by side on simple woven mats during their long hours of devotion. These mats, often humble and made from straw or coarse fibers, were reused day after day, worn thin by countless prayers. In an era long before modern understanding of germ theory or personal hygiene, the repeated use and sharing of these mats created an ideal environment for parasites to thrive and spread. Lice and scabies, tiny yet insidious parasites, found the close physical contact and shared surfaces of the monastic environment irresistible. These infestations caused intense itching, skin infections, and considerable discomfort, distracting monks from their spiritual duties and compromising their health. The very act of communal prayer, intended as a sacred unification with God and each other, paradoxically became a conduit for disease. Poor sanitation exacerbated the problem. Monasteries often lacked proper drainage and waste disposal systems, and bathing was infrequent due to ascetic practices or limited resources. Clothing and robes were washed rarely, and sleeping quarters were cramped and poorly ventilated. These conditions allowed infestations to become chronic, with monks suffering recurring bouts of skin irritation and secondary infections. Historical records and monastic chronicles occasionally mention outbreaks of such ailments, describing the suffering and the frustration they caused. Some abbots attempted remedies that ranged from herbal washes to isolating the most afflicted monks, but effective solutions were limited by contemporary medical knowledge and the strictures of monastic life. The emphasis on humility and endurance often meant that monks bore their afflictions silently, seeing suffering as a path to spiritual purification. The spread of disease through shared prayer mats also highlights a broader tension within medieval monasticism, the balance between communal life and individual well-being. While the community was the foundation of monastic existence, it also facilitated the transmission of illness. The close-knit nature of monastic orders, with their shared possessions and spaces, made complete isolation impossible, even in times of contagion. Moreover, this hidden epidemic challenges romanticized views of monastic life as purely peaceful and holy. Beneath the serene surface lay struggles with real physical suffering caused by conditions that modern sanitation would easily prevent. These ailments remind us that the monks were human, vulnerable to the same biological threats as any other medieval population. In reflecting on this, we gain insight into the everyday hardships that shaped monastic life, hardships that demanded resilience and faith. The monks' perseverance, despite constant itching, discomfort, and disease, speaks to a commitment that transcended physical pain, anchoring their spiritual focus even as their bodies endured relentless assaults. This story also invites us to appreciate the advances in hygiene and medicine that protect us today. What was once an invisible and relentless enemy hidden in the fibers of prayer mats is now understood and manageable, underscoring how far human knowledge and living conditions have evolved since those austere times. The disease that spread through shared prayer mats is a testament to the complexities of medieval monastic life, a world where the sacred and the mundane, the spiritual and the physical, were intertwined in profound and sometimes painful ways. It teaches us about the vulnerability of the human body, the power of community, and the hidden costs of devotion. Through this lens, we see the monks not only as spiritual seekers, but as survivors, men who confronted suffering in its many forms, from the spiritual to the microscopic, and who bore their trials with quiet endurance. Their story enriches our understanding of history, reminding us that faith and fragility have always walked hand in hand. This is the tale of a disease that silently traveled across prayer mats and robes, binding monks in shared suffering, yet never breaking their steadfast devotion.